let's recap a little of the special session before we start talking about some of the legislation that you've got presented in front of the General Assembly.
Sure.
Successful session, in your opinion?
Very much so. Yes, there were 3 bills that we were deliberating over, all proposed by the governor and all passed. The biggest one, of course, the Education Freedom Act, but also an important immigration bill and the bill to give relief to those in East Tennessee who were affected by Hurricane Helene.
I asked you the question, and the most intriguing aspect of the Education Scholarship Fund was, to me, not how some of the liberals toting the water of the unions and whatnot were against it. Those voices, the shrill, oh, this is going to destroy public education. For the most part, anyone learned on the subject just kind of dismisses those. But I think there were some legitimate concerns amongst libertarian conservative minds regarding what this would do, what it would accomplish. I'm sure you talked about this in Williamson County to your constituents. Walk me through, some of those concerns and how those discussions went and how you settled on the yay vote.
Sure. I heard primarily, I think, 3 concerns, mostly from conservatives. One was that this was just creating another entitlement program, growing the size of government, growing spending. Second, it was giving the government a way of getting its nose under the tent of private schools and potentially destroying private education. And then third, it didn't do anything to help public education, where 90% of our kids are and where we really need to focus. So those were the 3 principal objections I heard from my conservative constituents. But on balance, it seemed to me that when you're giving parents more choice, you are doing something that's good for the parent and good for the child, because we already have a system of choice the way the money follows the child under our TISA funding formula, where parents can enroll a child in the local public school. You can enroll a child in a different school in the same LEA. You can enroll the child in a neighboring county. If they're willing to accept the child, you can enroll the child in a charter school. And what the Education Freedom Act did was simply add another choice available to parents to take those TISA funds and enroll the child in a private school that likely was going to be teaching values that the parents agreed with.
And you're comfortable with, let me ask it this way. Do you think this is a starting point in terms of giving parents that choice that you mentioned? 20,000, the first 10 are needs based, and then it opens up. It's my understanding that, represents, roughly 2% of the overall public education population. We see how this goes and potentially expand it for others.
Yes, I think it's probably proper to look at the Education Freedom Act as a bit of a pilot program, even though it's not styled that way. But it is just 2% of our public school children. We have about 1 million kids in public schools, and obviously most parents are going to continue to choose to enroll their child in the local public school. Many parents are still happy with that option. So the Education Freedom Act was never designed to take all 1 million kids in public schools and move them somewhere else. That's not the case at all. But over time, there's a provision in the bill to grow by up to 5,000 scholarships per year, with the idea being that as many scholarships will ultimately be available to parents as those who want them.
In the General Assembly, obviously, there's a lot of lifting yet to be done. Clearly, you've got to deal with the budgets for the upcoming fiscal year. And then you have a number of pieces of legislation, one of which I wanted to talk with you about today, because I love it. I absolutely appreciate what you're trying to accomplish with regard to, are we calling it the One Flag Bill? Is that the proper terminology, or am I calling it the wrong thing?
We don't call it that. We call it the flag bill.
Sure. If
it's at a federal level, it's a one flag bill because there is just one flag.
Right.
Bill.
It makes more sense. There would be the 2 flag bill, right? Because,
that's a better way of saying it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Talk to everybody about that.
Sure. This is something that really began last session in the 113th General Assembly, where we had parents that were concerned about political flags being displayed in classrooms. And so we brought a bill to address that. And it was wildly successful in the House. We got 70 votes on the floor. It didn't quite get enough votes in the Senate. It got 13 favorable votes. It needed 17. So we brought that same bill back to remove political flags from our public school system. But then we added this year a provision that would require that any governmental entity that's receiving state funds for roads or for sidewalks or for public buildings not fly political flags, but rather they fly the U.S. flag, the Tennessee flag, or ultimately in whatever political subdivision they're in. Like I'm from the city of Brentwood, so if you were to go to the town hall, city hall, you would expect to see a U.S. flag, a Tennessee flag, maybe a Williamson County flag, and maybe a city of Brentwood flag. But the idea is that we want those flags that unite us all in order to be flying on our government buildings and along our highways. And we don't want pride flags being shown by image onto courthouses, as has been done here in Tennessee. We don't want that being painted on public roads, and we certainly don't want the pride flag being center stage on the White House, as we saw in the Biden administration in 2023.
It feels like, and you go right to the heart of it, it feels like this started with some of the various LGBTQ paraphernalia that, government agencies felt, compelled for some reason or another, to display on official government property, despite some of the objections of some of their constituencies. It feels like that's the way it started. But overall, it makes sense that a government installation paid for by taxpayer funding would stay out of those more political arenas and stick to political sovereignty of the U.S., sovereignty of the state of Tennessee, whatever municipality, as you mentioned, with a few exceptions.
Exactly. I mean, every piece of legislation typically starts with a problem that it's trying to solve. And here, we did see instances where some municipalities were taking public roadways and painting political flags on them, projecting images of political flags onto courthouses. And that's not something that actually unites us. That kind of divides us. And the flags that we see along our roadways and sidewalks and courthouses should be those that we can all agree are representative of the values that we all share as Tennesseans and as Americans.
What was the issue last year, to your understanding, on the Senate side? If it passed, that's 70 votes, you said, and that's
in the House.
And that would represent, I would think, almost every Republican voting in favor of this. I would expect that anything Gino is going to bring up, the Democrats are probably going to be against. But what was the objection last year, and have you spoken to anybody on the other side of the aisle about those objections? Do you feel like you've overcome those?
Sure, I think we have. The principal concern that I heard articulated was that there was some question as to whether what we were doing was constitutional. That is, did it comply with the free exercise clause of the First Amendment? And the short answer is yes, it does, because we've got really good Supreme Court precedent on these questions now, particularly our U.S. Supreme Court decision in the Kennedy versus Bremerton case from 2022. You may recall that was Coach Kennedy, who went and took a knee on the 50-yard line in the state of Washington as a football coach. Ultimately, in a 6-3 opinion, Justice Gorsuch said that there's a distinction here between government speech and private speech. And the First Amendment provides no protection for government speech, but it does for private speech. In the case of Coach Kennedy, he was on his own saying a silent prayer, and so that was private speech and protected. But where your speech actually is involved with your official duties, it's government speech, and therefore it's not protected under the Free Exercise Clause. And when you have a teacher or an administrator or a counselor displaying a political flag in front of kids that they're designed and required to teach, that is an official statement. Therefore, it's government speech, and it's not something protected by the Free Exercise Clause, and that's something we've explained to our Senate colleagues.
Right, and just to kind of get it to where the goats can graze on it, so the idea being that, a teacher wants to display a pride flag in their classroom, and under your legislation, that would be prohibited.
Correct.
And nobody's saying that teacher can't display it in their home, on their, whatever, in their private lives. Obviously, they can do as they wish. And my question would be, and you and I kind of talked about it a little before we went on air, is that if the naysayers or those that are objecting are correct, then is there no limitation to what a teacher could potentially put in their classroom? I mean, to use the most obvious and egregious example, I mean, if a teacher decided they wanted to display a Nazi flag in their classroom, would they not then argue that that is too protected speech? I mean, most people would recognize, obviously, we're not going to allow that to happen.
And that's the logical extension of the argument that a teacher would have a First Amendment right to display whatever she wanted to in her classroom. And obviously that's inappropriate because, as we said many times in the last session, parents send their kids to school to be educated, not to be indoctrinated. And there's just no reason that these political flags and political statements should be part of a K through 12 education in the state of Tennessee.
And I would note, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it feels to me like this legislation is asking the government to act as a neutral party to some of these political debates. That, we are in the United States of America. We are part of the state of Tennessee. We're proud of that. We're part of a local municipality or whatever, a particular school system, if a school system has a flag. But other than that, remain neutral in some of these other political style debates. It's not as if you're putting the thumb. I mean, the other side would seem to be the ones that are putting the thumb on the scale.
You're 100% correct, Matt, because sometimes you hear the other side say that they want to be inclusive. Well, actually, what they're doing is the opposite of being inclusive. They're being very divisive because we can all rally behind and around the U.S. flag and the Tennessee flags because those flags represent the values that we all hold and that we all share. And that's where we need to be focused, creating unity, not division, with the symbols that are displayed in school and on our public property. Exceptions.
Have you anticipated... I think you did this last year, if I'm not mistaken, anticipated, certain exceptions, to the general rule. The flag that comes to mind as I sit here and talk to you is the POW flag, for example. Are there going to be some exceptions to this?
Absolutely. I mean, we really don't want anyone to remove any flag that is not a political flag. But, laws are static. The world is dynamic. And so sometimes it's hard to craft a piece of legislation that can address all possible scenarios. And so we're going to have a fairly comprehensive list of things like POW, MIA flag, armed services flags, flags of universities, flags of schools, flags of other political subdivisions, flags of other countries, things that are legitimate and really do not in any way intend to indoctrinate a child as to a particular political point of view.
I think you're answering some of these questions that are popping up on the super text line, but I'll ask them. I mean, you just mentioned the service flag. So, someone asked, what about my U.S. Marine Corps flag? Obviously, that would be a protected flag. Would this affect private schools displaying the Christian flag, for example?
This only applies to public schools and public buildings. It does not get into any privately owned property.
Shouldn't this apply, writes 1733, shouldn't this apply to colleges and universities in Tennessee that are also receiving government funds?
The short answer is yes, and it does. I mean, the new part of it that deals with public buildings, obviously, universities are part of governmental entities, and so they are also within the purview of the new bill as drafted.
It occurs to me, Gino, that you and I sit here, we sit around, we talk about these issues, we know the types of things we're talking about. I understand that you have to craft the language of the bill in a more direct and particular way because you start dealing with people that are intentionally trying to crack your bill, right? But, we understand, and it's not just the gay pride flag, it is other political styled flags. Black Lives Matter had the, Antifa, whatever, but, you can name, and I can name other, perhaps right-wing organizations that might want to infuse political messaging into the school systems. We just want to keep that type of thing out of the school system and create a neutral field.
Absolutely. Left or right, if it's political, it's got no business being there in a K through 12 school or even in some of our public buildings. And so that's the whole design behind the legislation.
You've got this bill going on. What else do you have this General Assembly?
We're always looking to protect the unborn as much as we can. And one of the things that we've noticed is that despite the fact that we've eliminated elective abortion in Tennessee, we're having a problem with companies, particularly in the Northeast and in Mexico, sending abortion pills directly to patients, young ladies in the state of Tennessee, which is not only killing the unborn child, but it's also causing harm to many of the young ladies who are taking these without any type of medical supervision. And so I've got a bill, HB 26, that is designed to provide a civil remedy against companies that unlawfully send abortion pills into the state. It's already a felony under both federal law and state law, but nonetheless, it's going on and it's really not being stopped. And so the idea would be we would provide a wrongful death cause of action to any next of kin of the unborn child who's killed against one of these companies that feloniously send abortion pills into the state.
Try to kind of preemptively stop them from bringing them into the state for fear of civil liability should something happen along those lines.
Exactly. That's the idea.
HB 26, you said?
It is, yeah.
Well, we'll have you back on and we'll talk about these matters. Obviously, just getting the General Assembly cranked up. I appreciate you stopping by, particularly on the flag bill. We'll just say flag bill. And then, of course, the other legislation. Gino, always a pleasure.
Thank you, Matt.